Hi, I'm Jennie Miller, a senior scientist at Defenders of Wildlife, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. Today I'm going to share some highlights from my career in the nonprofit world. I'll be speaking about my career path and some highlights, including some of the fellowships and resources that helped me along the way. I'll share some general tips for shaping your career, and finally bring the spotlight onto some elements of working at an NGO. I'm very fortunate to come from a family that prioritized scholarship and recreation in the outdoors. I grew up in Northern California. And so one of my first sparks that inspired my conservation career was when I was on vacation with my father in India, my father's a yoga teacher. And along with touring the country, we also visited Corbett Tiger Reserve, where I saw my first tiger pug mark and heard stories from people about what it was like to live with tigers and leopards in their backyard. This really struck me and fascinated me, and I used it as kind of an inspiration to dive deeper into that topic, to major in organismal biology in college, and followed that thread of interest throughout, which enabled me to kind of have a theme to my career. So I encourage you to consider in your personal life or your professional life, those sparks which really drive you, and listen and reflect in order to identify where you might want to go with your own career. I did my undergraduate at Claremont McKenna College in Los Angeles and had two meaningful experiences during that time. One, during a summer, I worked as a field tech on pronghorn antelope in Colorado, and that began my lifelong interest in field work. And second, I did my senior thesis on poison dart frogs. I was trying to get more experience in the field. I actually raised money that wasn't publicized by writing an informal grant to our dean. So that's all to say, seek out free money where you can from the institutions where you're based. And that thesis research enabled me to publish my first peer-reviewed publication, which really helped me get a grounding in the science world and demonstrate that I could publish. After college, I did a policy internship at the Wildlife Society, where I worked on government affairs and monitored legislation related to wildlife and ecology. The internship showed me that I wasn't interested in policy enough to work in the government affairs office, but I was very interested in learning about the policy implications for conservation and how conservation and research can be done both on the ground at a fine level scale and requires policy in order to implement and oversee regulations that govern those wildlife. So this was an important process, and I encourage you to study or understand how policy can play an important role in conservation. I then did a Fulbright scholarship in India. The Fulbright is an incredible program I encourage you all to look up. You can do a Fulbright at different stages in your career. I did mine right after college, pretty much, affiliated with the Wildlife Institute of India, and I studied a number of threatened pheasant species in the Western Himalayas and was able to publish some of my research because this is an area where not many people get to in the world. I also deepened my understanding of India as a system and actually realized that I wanted to learn even more and dive into the topic of human-wildlife conflict. And so I then pursued a PhD. I was very fortunate to receive a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program to support my work in my PhD. I didn't do a master's because of the way the logistics of the grant worked out. But the NSF GRFP is a really incredible resource, another pot of free money waiting to support your graduate work. And I wanted to point out too that I didn't get it the first time. First, I was an honorary mention, and I applied the second year in which I was successful. So that's all to say, don't give up on your dreams. Sometimes it does take several years of applying for a program or a scholarship in order to learn what they want. I did my PhD at the Yale School of Forestry and acknowledge how hard it is to get into grad school. So I've included some career tips on my website that you can find at that address. I chose FES because it had a strong reputation as a great school, a really intimate community of scholars, and it had adequate resources. It could provide me a great starting starting grants for doing my work in South Asia, along with language training in Hindi and a great scholarly community all focused around South Asia. I was also very fortunate to get into a great lab working with Oz Schmitz on predator-prey interactions, which I used to frame my PhD on predicting human-wildlife conflicts. So I looked at tiger and leopard depredation on livestock across a Kanha Tiger Reserve in central India, and did some modeling and mapping, and then applied that to management. So did a really applied PhD, which enabled me to partner with WWF India and affiliate with the Wildlife Institute of India, as well as the Indian Forest Department. So again, starting to understand partnerships and how conservation stakeholders do work on the ground. I followed that up with a postdoc at Panthera and then at UC Berkeley, in which I studied lions and leopards in Africa, shifted my focus from Asia to Africa to learn more about conservation in that landscape and some of the mechanisms used for conservation, like sustainable trophy hunting and collaborative management partnerships in order to effectively run protected areas. And finally, after basically 10 years of a career, PhD, 2 postdocs, and many different countries of work, I was very fortunate to be hired as a senior scientist at Defenders of Wildlife, which again shifted my geographic focus to North America, because Defenders' mission is to protect native plants and animals in North America. In this role, I provide support to our field staff, policy staff, legal staff on species across the country and the continent. And so now I work on more species than I ever did before, and have expanded my repertoire of doing science relevant for policy, law, and field conservation. Next, I want to share 8 tips for a successful career that I've learned throughout my own career. First, notice what excites you. Remember that spark I talked about. It's important to be reflective and to notice what inspires you, because your career is a long process and really needs to be focused on something you're passionate about. Second, dream big, then figure out how to get there. I knew that I needed a PhD because I talked to enough people and they told me that I needed a PhD in order to become a senior scientist in an NGO. But I didn't know how to get there at first. And so I did a lot of research. I applied for a lot of grants and fellowships and positions, and it was only through all of that work was I able to realize my dream. 3, get free money, grants, and fellowships. I've talked about a number of these that helped me along the way, but there's a lot of free money out there, and all it takes is time and dedication on your part to figure out how to get it. So I really encourage you to check out the Fulbright, the NSF GRFP, and other similar grants that you're eligible for. 4, use your network. It's important to do informational interviews throughout your career to help you better understand the positions that you are interested in, the requirements to get there, and also to expand your personal network to make sure that you know the right people in the world that matters for the work that you'd like to do. 5, enthusiasm and perseverance can take you farther than test scores. While it is important to demonstrate that you are reliable and can follow through with commitments, which are sometimes reflected in your test scores and grades, it's more important in the field of conservation to demonstrate that you know how to work with NGOs or stakeholders on the ground, that you show enthusiasm and passion and you know what you're talking about. So demonstrate that by getting experience, not just focusing on grades. 6, don't let others discourage you. In college, I had a professor who meant well, but when I told her I wanted to study wildlife and animals in particular, she told me that that's impossible, it's too competitive, you should just study plants. Now, I love plants too, and I work on them now, but they weren't where my passion lay. And so I actually was inspired by her discouragement because that's my personality. And so pretty soon after that, I actually landed that pronghorn antelope technician position. So that's all to say, don't let others discourage you, because you will encounter that. And that's their own experience. It doesn't have to be yours. 7, be strategic. It's important to do your homework and to make a plan, even if there are spontaneous arisings like international pandemics that may cause things to go awry. But if you can be strategic, then you can make a plan and understand where you need to go in order to get where you want to be. And 8, realize that you can change the world. I've spent a lot of time myself contemplating whether the effort that I'm putting into something is the right thing, the most impactful thing, but realize that small local steps do lead to big global changes. And so I invite you to take time to think about the bigger picture of conservation, the many steps from local field conservation to broad policy mechanisms, everything that's required to get protections out there, and then realize at which point along that gradient you're impacting, because it will help you understand how you are impacting the world and better keep that context in mind. Finally, I'd like to share 10 things that are useful to know about working in an NGO. First, you can make a living salary. Using Glassdoor, I know that the average scientist working at an NGO in Washington, D.C. makes between $70,000 and $100,000 every year. Use resources like Glassdoor to research salaries and to understand that you can make a profitable salary, a living wage in this field. It's terribly sad when people don't pursue a major or a certain position because they don't think they can make the salary they need, but they also haven't researched it. So do your homework and realize that you can make a living salary. 2, your work happens only during business hours. This was one of the first things I was very excited to see about working at Defenders of Wildlife. I primarily do my work between 9 and 5:30. I don't work on the weekends anymore like I used to do in academia, and there's social pressure within the NGO to limit your work to business hours because there's a lot of work going on and only so much time to do it. It's important to realize that people have families and work, a life outside of work. 3, your work contributes to the organization's mission. As a researcher in academia, I could study whatever I wanted, but when I joined Defenders of Wildlife, I was brought into the organization's mission. So my scope of work primarily focuses on plants and animals in North America. While this felt a little frustrating at first because I came from an international background, I realized that working within an organization's mission means that you are joining a club of people who are all dedicated to the same mission. And by investing your resources and focus there, you're more likely to accomplish that mission. 4, you report to a boss. This may seem obvious because we always have some sort of an advisor or supervisor in our life, but having a boss, a supervisor, while based in an NGO is very different than having an academic advisor who offers guidance. But you report to your boss, you are responsible for filling out the duties that that supervisor has laid out for the scope of your position. And so that boss can both offer you guidance, brainstorming, and also sidelines to keep your work within. 5, you work as a member of a team. This means that you can not only take advantage of the expertise of your teammates, but you are also part of a we, no longer that I, which really stands out in academia where you're trying to cultivate and refine a sense of your own brand. When you're part of an NGO, you are a member of a team, part of a mission. That also means you can take advantage of the departments like communications, marketing, and fundraising to help benefit your work. 6, your colleagues are brilliant. Realize that positions within an NGO are few and far between. That means they're competitive and that you need to be at the top of your game to join an NGO. That also means that the people around you are real experts in what they know about. And so you're working with the best. 7, your deadlines have real-world consequences. In academia, you may be able to take an extra week or two to get a project or a paper done, but not in an NGO, especially when you have quick turnover of deadlines that do have real-world consequences. At Defenders of Wildlife, sometimes we only have 30 days or 90 days to submit a policy comment letter on a regulation that could have really intense consequences for wildlife. So it's important to realize that you will have deadlines and you need to meet those. 8, the pace is very fast. This can be both exhilarating for people who like to stay busy like me, but it can also be overwhelming if you can't find a balance in your life. So prioritization and to-do lists are very important. 9, this means that perfection is not an option. Realizing what's good enough to get a product out there is infinitely important. It's more important to deliver a product that's half-baked or not perfect than it is to deliver nothing at all. And so perfection is not an option is a very important lesson in working for an NGO. 10, the work is tied to real-world outcomes and measurable impacts. When you work at an NGO, you need to evaluate the way that the work is being done so that you can report to donors and also ensure that the work you're doing is being done in the best way so you can adapt and improve. And so this also means that I feel very fulfilled working for Defenders of Wildlife because I can actually evaluate and measure the way that I'm impacting the world. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope that you consider joining an NGO. There are a lot of them out there related to wildlife and ecology. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I also invite you to visit my personal website where I've put up a number of career resources to help you along the way. So best of luck with your career.